Step into the illuminating realm of the Four Noble Truths, meticulously curated by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Jeffrey Degraff. Delve into the profound teachings of Buddhism through the audiobook version, graciously presented by the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf YouTube channel. Explore the timeless truths unraveling the nature of suffering, its origins, cessation, and the path to liberation. As you embark on this transformative expedition, we extend an invitation for you to play a pivotal role in sharing the wisdom of the Buddha. Your likes, shares, and subscriptions are the catalysts propelling these teachings to a broader audience. Let's join forces in disseminating profound insights and nurturing a community dedicated to the pursuit of inner peace and understanding. Together, we can cast light on the path to enlightenment for seekers worldwide. Chapter 9. Pondering the Truth. As the Buddha explains the steps to follow in awakening to the truth, once you've heard the Dharma, such as the teachings of the step-by-step discourse or the Four Noble Truths, you try to remember it. Then you try to penetrate the meaning of the words. Once you understand them, you ponder them until you find that they make sense. This is called coming to an agreement through pondering the teachings. The purpose of all this thinking is to give rise to the desire to put the teachings into practice. The Buddha notes that it's possible to listen to the Dharma with the purpose of finding fault with it, interpreting it in ways that make no sense, but that defeats the purpose of listening to it in the first place, as a step in putting an end to your suffering. Although he doesn't ask you to put your critical faculties aside as you listen, he does advise you to use them wisely. Instead of pouncing on what seems not to make sense as proof that the Dharma is wrong, you think and then ask questions of the person teaching the Dharma to gain clarification whenever you can't resolve your own doubts. As the Buddha said, he trained his students in cross-questioning, asking the meaning of whatever isn't clear, so that they could allay their doubts, and then that they be willing to be cross-questioned, too, so that they could help allay the doubts of others. This means that part of the onus is on the teacher to present the Dharma in a clear and convincing manner, and to be patient in clearing up points you find unclear. But part of the onus is also on you, the student, to bring the right attitude to the process of trying to make sense of what the teacher has to say. The right attitude is composed of the two qualities that the Buddha said he looked for in a student: that you be truthful and observant, but it also includes a third: that you bring an attitude of goodwill. 1. When you're truthful and observant, it helps you to understand clearly why you might be holding to any views that are getting in the way of accepting the basic principles of the Dharma. 2. When you bring an attitude of goodwill for yourself, it helps you to see that you would benefit from abandoning those views. At the same time, when you bring an attitude of goodwill for the Dharma and for those who teach it, it motivates you to look for ways of resolving any conflicts you might perceive in the teachings. Let's look at these points in more detail. The canon shows that the Buddha had to deal with many people who rejected the Dharma on the grounds that it didn't fit in with views they already held. Their major issues centered on the fact that the Buddha's two categorical teachings on the need to abandon unskillful actions and develop skillful actions, and on the Four Noble Truths, didn't fit in with their views about the world and the self. Some, for instance, believed that the self was powerless to act. Others believed that actions were unreal. Others, that the world was totally chaotic, following no laws of cause and effect. For them, a path of action that would result in the end of suffering would be impossible. Now, as we noted in Chapter 6, world and self are the basic concepts of becoming, and becoming is precisely what the Four Noble Truths are designed to end. This means that, from the Buddha's perspective, those who had trouble accepting the Dharma had the context backwards. They were trying to fit the Four Noble Truths into the context of becoming as they understood and clung to their ideas of self and world, whereas he had formulated the Four Noble Truths as the context for showing how any type of becoming came about as a result of a process, and how that process could and should be made to cease. To show that he was operating in a different context and that they should, too, the Buddha often refused to take a stand on the hot philosophical issues of his day that fell within the context of becoming. Some of these issues concerned the nature of the world. Did the world exist? Did it not exist? Was it eternal? Not eternal? Infinite? Finite? Was it all one? Was it a multiplicity? Will all the world gain awakening? Will a half? A third? Other issues that he put aside concern the nature of the self. Is there a self? Is there no self? Do I exist? Do I not exist? What am I? How am I? Am I basically good? Basically bad? Is the self the same as the body? Is the self one thing and the body another? After death, does an awakened being exist? Not exist? Both? Neither? Some of these issues the Buddha put aside on the grounds that they were irrelevant to the practice. Trying to answer them would simply squander time better spent on putting an end to suffering. Other issues he put aside on the grounds that however you answered the issue, it would stand directly in the way of the practice. For instance, with the issue of the self, the Buddha noted that however you defined yourself, you would be placing limitations on yourself, limitations that would get in the way of the practice for awakening. To begin with, if you assert that you have a self no matter how you define it, you'll naturally cling to whatever you define as self, and that clinging will prevent you from putting an end to suffering. On top of that, specific ways of defining your sense of self would place additional limitations on you as well. For example, if you define yourself around your physical body, there's the problem that the body doesn't exist in unbinding. That would mean that if you gained awakening, you would be annihilated, an idea that would discourage you from practicing. Similarly, if you defined yourself as nothing more than a conditioned being, you wouldn't be able to know anything unconditioned, and that would mean that an unconditioned end of suffering would be beyond your ken. If you defined yourself as interconnected with all other beings, that would mean that no one could gain awakening until everyone gained awakening. From that, it would follow that the Buddha was never awakened, and that you, on your own, could never put an end to suffering, either. If you tried to get around that problem by defining all beings as already awakened, simply that they don't realize it, the problem is that beings are still suffering, which means that awakening would not mean the end of suffering. On the other hand, if you decided that you and all other beings have no self, that would place limitations on you, too. You wouldn't be responsible for your choices, which would make it impossible to embark on any path of practice at all. At the same time, there would be no one to benefit or be harmed by your actions. That idea would encourage irresponsible actions and discourage you from making the effort to follow the path. These are some of the reasons why the Buddha avoided taking a position on many of the controversial issues around self and world that excited his contemporaries, and that still excite many people today. Now, it's not the case that the Buddha refused to take a position on all the philosophical issues of his time. He did take a stand on issues of karma and rebirth, and the truths about suffering and its end, because these gave clear answers to what he saw was the primary issue: how to know which actions are skillful and which are not. It's just that he was radical in claiming that this particular issue should override all others. So if you find yourself having trouble fitting the teachings on karma or the Four Noble Truths into your views about yourself or the world, the problem is that you've got the context backward. Instead, you should see how your views about yourself and the world fit under the Four Noble Truths. However, to reverse the context with issues like these isn't easy. After all, your sense of self and world deals with your perception of what really is. It's hard not to cling to what you see as real. Fortunately, the Buddha gives guidance in how to loosen your grip. This is where the qualities of truthfulness, goodwill, and being observant come in. In terms of truthfulness and goodwill, you may remember from Chapter 2 that a major aspect of your truthfulness as a person is expressed in how truthful you are in citing the basis for your opinions. In the case of the monastic discipline, this means truth in citation. Being clear about the status of the evidence you bring when accusing a fellow monastic of misbehavior. Is it based on what you saw, what you heard, or only on what you suspected? In a similar way, the ability to loosen your grip on your opinions about the reality of the world and the self requires that you examine your basis for holding them. As the Buddha points out, they may be based on conviction in someone else's authority, such as the authority of a religious teacher, a text, or a scientist, Or they might be based on what you like, on analogy, or on what you feel has been well reasoned. When you examine these reasons, though, you realize that they don't count as direct knowledge. They're nothing more than hypotheses. They could be true or they could be false. When you realize how tenuous the evidence is for any view about the world or the self, it makes it easier to put that view aside. If you don't really know whether the end of suffering is possible, why choose a hypothesis that would close off the possibility that it could be true? If you had goodwill for yourself, you'd want to adopt any reasonable hypothesis that leaves that possibility open. As for being observant, the Buddha suggests that if you hold to a view that conflicts with the Four Noble Truths, you should examine your motivation for holding to it, and the actions that result when you act on it. Why hold to a view that denies the power of your actions to put an end to suffering? What allure does the view hold for you? Why do you like holding it? Does it lead you to do things that are skillful? Or does it discourage skillful behavior? For instance, as the Buddha points out, if you don't believe that you have the power to choose your actions, if you think that you live in a world totally predetermined by physical laws, there's no motivation for exerting yourself to be skillful in what you do, say, or think. So what incentive would you have for holding to that view? Being truthful with yourself and answering these questions corresponds to the two other types of truthfulness discussed in Chapter 2 in connection with monastic discipline: truth in observation and truth in reporting. You're true in accounting for your inner motivation for holding to a view, and you make an extra effort to accurately perceive the actual results of the actions inspired by the view. Again, when you can be truthful with yourself in these ways, it makes it easier to show goodwill for yourself and to put the view aside. In all these cases, being truthful in citing the source for your view and being observant about the motivation for and karmic results of holding the view, you've also begun to reverse the context. You've learned how to take the issue of skillful and unskillful action and give it priority over concepts of self and world. Adopting this context also makes it easier to resolve conflicts you might perceive in the Dharma. That's because most of these conflicts come from getting the context wrong, trying to fit the Buddha's two categorical teachings into the context provided by his other teachings. But when you realize that the categorical teachings provide the context into which the other teachings should fit, the perceived conflicts go away. A case in point concerns the Buddha's teachings on self and not self. When he says that all phenomena should be seen as not self, he seems to be making a metaphysical assertion. There is no self. But then there are passages where he states that the self is its own mainstay, and that you should take yourself as a governing principle in order to stay on the path. This sounds like he's being inconsistent. If there's no self, how can you rely on yourself to be a mainstay or a governing principle in any way at all? Some people have tried to resolve this apparent inconsistency by proposing that the Buddha spoke on two levels of language: ultimate and conventional. On the ultimate level, there really is no self. However, on the conventional level, the unreflective level of ordinary, everyday language, there is a self. But this explanation simply compounds the problem. If there really is no self, then when the Buddha talks of the self as its own mainstay, he's employing a useful fiction in his terms, a beneficial falsehood. But as he himself indicated, in his eyes there is no such thing. A better way of resolving the conflict is to see how the teachings on self and not self fit into the context of the Four Noble Truths. We can begin by recalling that the Buddha's attitude toward truths expressed in words. They're instrumental. They're true to the extent that they really work in bringing about the aim for which they're formulated. They're consistent with one another to the extent that they act together in bringing about that aim. This means that, in the case of concepts of self and not self, we have to consider how they function on their own, and how they function together to arrive at the end of suffering. It's because of this emphasis on function that the Buddha put aside questions concerning whether the self does or doesn't exist. Instead, he looked at your sense of self and of not self as perceptions, i.e., actions. In other words, his teachings on self and not self weren't intended to answer such questions as, does the self exist? Do I exist? Rather, they were intended to answer the questions that the Buddha said lay at the beginning of discernment. What, when I do it, will lead to my long-term harm and suffering? And what, when I do it, will lead to my long-term welfare and happiness? Applied to issues of self and not self, these questions become: when do these action perceptions lead to long-term harm and suffering, and when do they lead to long-term welfare and happiness? As you recall, the Buddha's analysis of the perception of self comes in the context of becoming. You adopt a sense of self as agent, consumer, and commentator as a strategy for achieving happiness by attaining the object of the desire around which the becoming coalesced. The agent is what does the actions to get the desired result, the consumer enjoys the result, and the commentator judges how well the agent has acted and recommends future improvements. As it so happens, the concept of not-self is also implied in that strategy. Anything that's irrelevant to these functions or stands in their way is regarded as not-self. When we divorce the sense of self from metaphysical issues, in other words, when we don't concern ourselves with pinning down exactly what the self is, or if it is, we're left with perceptions of self and not self as negotiating strategies for happiness, centered on what they do. And as the Buddha noted in his second recorded talk, a primary aspect of what a self does is that it exerts control. You label as self whatever you find to be worth trying to control to bring about happiness. This applies most directly to the self as agent as it tries to control events in the mind and the world outside, but also to the self as consumer and commentator. The self as consumer tries to possess and hold on to whatever happiness the self as agent finds for it. The self as commentator gets feedback from the self as consumer, and then uses that to try to influence the self as agent. Conversely, the perception of not-self is also related to the concept of control. You label as not-self whatever can't be controlled or you decide is not worth trying to control, so that you can focus your efforts for control on areas where they will give the best results. So the choice to apply either of these perceptions comes down to a value judgment. What's worth trying to control and what's not? Because this value judgment will change according to circumstances, your sense of self will change over time, as will your sense of the line dividing self from not self. This is how these concepts function in ordinary states of becoming, and it's also how they function on the path to the cessation of suffering. As we've noted many times, the fourth noble truth is a path that's fabricated for the sake of achieving an unfabricated goal. For that reason, it carries two duties, performed in stages. First, it has to be developed. Then, when it's been developed and completed its work, it has to be abandoned, so that the unfabricated has nothing standing in its way. As it turns out, one of the main factors of the path, right concentration, starts as a state of becoming on the level of form. This means that developing the path will require developing a state of becoming, which in turn entails a sense of self in all of its three roles. The self who's capable of following the path and giving rise to right concentration. The self who anticipates benefiting from following the path, and the self who comments on how well the path is progressing and how it might be further developed. As for how true these perceptions of self might be, the Buddha notes that states of becoming don't lie under your total control because they're composed of the five aggregates. If you could totally control them, they wouldn't entail suffering. However, even though you can't exert total control over the aggregates, you can control them to the extent of using them in fabricating right concentration and all the other factors of the Noble Eightfold Path. So to whatever extent your perceptions of self help you to succeed in developing those factors, those perceptions are true. As for perceptions of not self, while you're developing the path, you apply these perceptions to anything that might pull you off the path. This would include any attachments that might tempt you to engage in wrong speech, wrong action, or wrong livelihood. It would also include any thoughts that might distract you from right mindfulness or right concentration. However, when the path has been fully developed, and right view has succeeded in developing dispassion toward craving for all other things, that's when your duty with regard to the path is to abandon it. You see that your sense of self, which you adopted as a strategy for happiness, is now the only thing standing in the way of the highest happiness. It no longer serves the purpose for which you developed it. It's because of that insight that, for the sake of the even greater happiness promised by the third noble truth, you strategically apply the perception of not-self to all fabricated phenomena, the path included. Then, to make sure that you don't try to cling to the experience of the deathless that's revealed when all fabrications have disbanded, you apply the perception of not-self even to the unfabricated, and then you abandon that perception, too, to be free of any trace of the terms of becoming. That's how the path leads beyond fabrication to the all-around ending of clinging, and the total end of suffering. So when we put the teachings on self and not self in their proper context as strategies for happiness in general, and as tools for completing the duties of the Four Noble Truths in particular, we see that they contain no contradiction at all. There's no need to assume two levels of language in the Buddha's teachings, and no need to doubt that we can take him at his word. What he said was always true and beneficial. It's up to us to know how to use his words so that they're timely in our practice. This, of course, is only one example of how you might resolve your doubts about specific teachings in the Dharma, but it underlines an important point in how to go about resolving doubts about other Dharma teachings as well. Always make sure you have the context right. When you keep the Four Noble Truths foremost and can figure out how other teachings fit within those truths, you can see how the Dharma makes strategic sense. Pondering in these ways, adopting the Four Noble Truths as the basic structure for your thinking about yourself, the world, and the path of practice, is the ideal way to develop the discernment that comes from thinking things through. It's also the first stage in what the Buddha calls appropriate attention, which he cited as the foremost internal factor leading to awakening. The next step in appropriate attention is to foster the discernment that comes from actually developing the qualities of your mind. You do that by following the duties appropriate to the Four Noble Truths, taking them as the basic framework for deciding how to act in thought, word, and deed. Chapter 10. Performing the duties. When the Buddha lists the steps in how to awaken to the truth, those that foster the third type of discernment gained by developing the qualities of your mind are 5. Desire, willingness, judgment, exertion, and finally awakening to the truth. The desire, here, is the desire to follow the duties appropriate to the Four Noble Truths. This desire is wise because you realize that the truths were not meant just to think about or to discuss. They were meant to lead you to the reality of the end of suffering, and they can do that only if you act on them, performing the duties they entail. The desire to perform these duties can be inspired by any number of reasons. Most fundamental, according to the canon, is heedfulness. You realize the dangers that come from not following the duties of the truths you'd be subject to endless rounds of death and rebirth, but you also realize that you have it within your power to avoid those dangers and to find safety by taking those duties seriously and performing them as best you can. A related reason for the desire to practice would be compassion, both for yourself and for others. You realize that you can put an end to your own suffering, and in the course of following the path you lessen the sufferings of others through the practice of generosity, virtue, and gaining some control over the unskillful qualities of your mind. You also provide other people with a good example for how they, too, can seek happiness in a responsible way. Another reason for the desire to practice comes from a sense of self-esteem. If other people can do this, why can't I? Notice that these 3 motivations for desire use different aspects of your perception of self. Self-esteem focuses on the self as agent, capable of following the path. Compassion focuses on the self as consumer, benefiting from the path and finding enjoyment in helping others. And heedfulness focuses on all 3 aspects of self. The self as agent, capable of making a difference through its actions, the self as consumer to be protected by those actions, and the self as commentator looking for the best way to find long-term safety and happiness. The next 3 steps, willingness, judgment, and exertion, derive from the desire to practice. Willingness means agreeing to submit to the standards set by the Four Noble Truths for determining what's best to do, over and above your personal preferences. You accept the fact that many of your past standards for acting, speaking, and thinking based on craving and clinging have actually led to suffering, and you're willing to give the Buddha's recommendations for better ways of acting a try. This, as you remember, is one of the reasons why the Four Noble Truths are called noble. They require you to stand apart from your cravings and clingings, and to relinquish them when you can see that they really are harmful. Judgment. The Pali term, tulana, literally means weighing or comparing, means comparing your thoughts, words, and deeds against the standard set by the Four Noble Truths, to judge where they do and don't measure up. In particular, instead of judging whether to follow a particular course of action based on what you find pleasant to do, you judge it as to whether it counts as skillful or unskillful in the long term, and then based on that judgment, you determine whether it should be followed or abandoned. Exertion is when you actually carry through with whatever effort is needed to follow what's skillful or to abandon what's not. If the duties of the Four Noble Truths go against your personal preferences, in other words, they tell you to abandon a course of action you'd find pleasant to do, or tell you to do something you find hard, you draw on your desire, willingness, and judgment to help induce you to do the right thing. As you begin gaining good long-term results from your exertions, those results help to strengthen your desire and willingness to follow the path even further. You actually come to delight in the practice. The Buddha notes that this delight is an important element in nourishing the stamina needed to stick with the path all the way to the end. The fact that you're getting good long-term results from your exertions also helps to sharpen your judgment as to which actions are actually skillful or not. This shows that these four qualities, desire, willingness, judgment, and exertion, don't follow one another in a single file. They work together to make one another strong. The same reciprocal relationship can be seen in other ways in which the Buddha describes how qualities of the mind work together to help you to progress on the path and develop your discernment. In his simplest description, he says that the Dharma is nourished by two activities: commitment and reflection. You commit to following the path, and then you reflect on the results coming from your efforts. If you see that the results aren't what you hoped for, you reflect on how you might change your actions, and then commit yourself to following the lessons you've learned. In this process, the commitment corresponds to desire, willingness, and exertion. The reflection corresponds directly to judgment, but indirectly to exertion, too. It takes effort to look at your own actions with a skillfully critical eye. Another of the Buddha's descriptions for this stage of the practice is one we met in Chapter 8. You use right view, right mindfulness, and right effort to circle around every attempt to master each factor of the path. These three circling factors are all based on desire. The desire to reap the results of the practice. Right view corresponds to judgment in the role of maintaining standards. Right mindfulness corresponds to judgment in remembering how to apply those standards to particular situations. Right effort corresponds to exertion. Right mindfulness, in its role as alertness, then steps in again to judge the results of your efforts, teaches right view whatever lessons can be derived from those efforts, and remembers to apply those lessons to future events. However, probably the best way to understand the way these skillful mental qualities function together as you start and progress on the path is to look at how the Buddha explained the steps in applying the basic principles of the practice to his son, Rahula, when Rahula was 7 years old. His explanations were essentially instructions in how best to develop the two qualities that the Buddha, as we have noted, looked for in any student: truthfulness and good powers of observation. He started with truthfulness. Rahula had seen the Buddha approaching from afar, and so set out a pot of water and a dipper. When the Buddha arrived, he washed his feet with the water in the pot, leaving a little water in the dipper. Showing the dipper to Rahula, he asked him, "Do you see how little water there is in this dipper?" "Yes, sir." "That's how little of the quality of a contemplative there is in anyone who tells a deliberate lie with no sense of shame." The Buddha then threw the water away, showed Rahula the empty dipper, and then turned the dipper upside down, making the point each time that when you tell a deliberate lie with no sense of shame, your quality of a contemplative is thrown away, empty, and overturned. Having stressed the importance of truthfulness, the Buddha went on to give instructions in how to be observant. Just as you'd use a mirror for repeated reflection, in the same way you should reflect on your actions again and again. When planning to do an action in body, speech, or mind, you should reflect on it beforehand. This action I want to do, would it lead to self-affliction, to the affliction of others, or to both? Would it be an unskillful action, with painful consequences, painful results? If you anticipate that it would cause harm, you should refrain from it. If you anticipate no harm, you can go ahead and start doing it. While doing the action, you should reflect on its immediate results. This action I'm doing, is it leading to self-affliction, to the affliction of others, or to both? If you see that it's causing harm, you should stop then and there. If you see no harm, you can continue with it. After the action is done, you're still not done. You should reflect on it again. This action I've done, did it lead to self-affliction, to the affliction of others, or to both? Was it an unskillful action, with painful consequences, painful results? If you see that it did cause harm even though you didn't anticipate it, then if it was a bodily or verbal action, you should confess it to a fellow practitioner more advanced on the path, to see what advice you can gain on how not to repeat that mistake. Then you try to exercise restraint in the future. If it was a mental action, you should develop a healthy sense of shame around it, seeing that it was beneath you, and exercise future restraint. But if you see that the action caused no harm at all, then you take joy in that fact and continue training in this way, day and night. What the Buddha is teaching here is how to apply the practice of cross-questioning to your own actions. You focus your powers of observation on bringing the concept of skillful and unskillful actions to bear on what you're doing, saying, and thinking in real time. This framework of skillful and unskillful actions, as you'll recall, develops eventually into the framework of the Four Noble Truths. Craving counts as an unskillful action, the suffering of clinging is its result. The Noble Eightfold Path counts as skillful action, the abandoning of craving is its result. In effect, the Buddha's showing how to use this framework to learn from your mistakes. You commit yourself to abandoning bad intentions and acting only on good ones. It's when you act on good intentions that you can most willingly admit your mistakes and learn from them. When you see in practice that even good intentions can sometimes lead to harm, you realize the need to learn from that harm, so as not to repeat it, and to make sure that your intentions become even better than good. They have to be based on practical knowledge to be genuinely skillful. These instructions embody the 4 steps in awakening to the truth that we noted above. You willingly submit to this training, and then judge your actions by it, both in terms of the motivation behind them, and in terms of their actual results. Then, based on that judgment, you exert yourself to make your actions more and more skillful, at the same time taking joy whenever you succeed. This joy, as we've noted, is what maintains your desire to continue with the training. These instructions also embody the 3 types of truthfulness that we discussed in connection with monastic training. You try to be truthful in perceiving the actual motivation and results of your actions, and in reporting your mistakes. You do this so that you can move from beliefs of what's skillful based on the usual basis for truthfulness in citation, conviction, reasoning, or respect for an outside authority, to actual knowledge of what's skillful, based on direct personal experience. Of course, you're engaged in actions all the time, which means that as you continue with this practice, you have to become skilled in applying these instructions with greater and greater speed. This may be why, when the Buddha compares the skills of a meditator to those of a trained archer, he says that the ability to see your thoughts, words, and deeds in terms of the 4 Noble Truths is like the archer's ability to fire shots in rapid succession. When you follow the Buddha's instructions to his son, you see that adopting the framework of the 4 Noble Truths as a guide to your actions develops good qualities both of the mind and of the heart. That's why the training they offer is complete. In terms of the heart, they teach heedfulness in that you take the results of your actions seriously, compassion in that you don't want to do harm, determination to follow this ideal in all your actions, a sense of honor in holding to this ideal, a healthy sense of shame over the times when you do cause harm, truthfulness in your willingness to admit your mistakes to yourself and to others, and integrity in taking responsibility for any harm you've done. These qualities of the heart are another area where we can see the nobility of the training provided by the Four Noble Truths. As for qualities of mind, the Buddha's instructions develop the cluster of qualities needed for practical discernment. In his list of the factors for awakening, he notes that the discernment factor, which he calls analysis of qualities, is developed by applying appropriate attention to skillful and unskillful qualities as they arise in the mind. This means stepping back from their content and looking at them as part of a causal process, seeing the internal causes that foster them and the consequences of acting on them. This is precisely what the Buddha taught to Rahula. The Buddha also notes that when you apply appropriate attention in this way, you also starve the hindrance of doubt. You then use this approach to develop the other factors for awakening: mindfulness, persistence, rapture, calm, concentration, and equanimity, and to abandon the other hindrances to right concentration: sensual desire, ill will, sloth and lethargy, and restlessness and anxiety. And it's not too hard to see how the Buddha's instructions to Rahula help to develop the three factors of the path that circle around the development of all the path factors. Right view teaches you to avoid causing harm. Right mindfulness keeps that lesson in mind each time you act, at the same time observing and reflecting to see how well you're following it. And right effort makes the effort to commit to the path of harmlessness in your thoughts, words, and deeds at all times. Right mindfulness, through its sub-function of alertness, observes and reflects to learn from the lessons of actually following through with right effort, and then teaches those lessons to right view, so that your views about right and wrong ways to follow the path are even better informed and more precise. It's in this way that the practice of using appropriate attention as you commit to the path teaches you to become more and more discerning as to what the path actually is. You take the knowledge you gain from the words describing the path and use it to give rise to a direct experience of the mental qualities that form the reality of the path in your own mind. This is how, in connection with the Noble Truths, you move from the truths of words to the truth of realities. As you gain this discernment through developing, it teaches you lessons not only about the reality of the Fourth Noble Truth. It also teaches you lessons about how that truth relates to the reality of the first two Noble Truths, in order to arrive at the reality of the third. Those are the lessons we'll consider in the next chapter. Thank you for tuning in. Your support is invaluable, and as we conclude this episode, we encourage you to show your appreciation by liking, sharing, and subscribing. Your engagement fuels our commitment to spreading Buddha's wisdom, and we look forward to having you as an integral part of our journey.